So now for a practice run in Silent Service 2. I'm not clear on what the digitized voice capability is. I said yes for the choice, and so far I haven't heard any digitized voices in the game, so I don't know what that's about. So anyway, they test you on your knowledge of Japanese ships in the game here, partly I think as a copy protection. So I picked the training mission, but first I'll point out that you can do a single battle or convoy action, like in Silent Service 1. You could do a war patrol, or you can do an entire career for the whole war, or some portion of the war. I picked the easiest difficulty there, and I set the date for the first day of the war, officially. And then I opted for an old S-class, even though they weren't the first to see combat, because Tambor class or T-class was at Pearl Harbor on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. But there aren't too many simulators or games that feature the old S-class from the teens and 20s. So I figured it would be the most interesting one maybe to try. So I ended up in command of the S-37. I was hoping for the S-48 because that was Admiral Rickover's first submarine. But as I've said in previous videos, your submarine is selected randomly in Silent Service 2. You only get to choose the class, not the specific sub. So they start you from a dead stop on the surface. So here I'm going to dive the sub to periscope depth. The maximum depth on an S-class, at least in Silent Service 2, is 200 feet. But it's not very useful for much, because at 200 feet you're kind of a target that can't shoot back. So with periscope depth, at least you can shoot back. So I settled on 43 feet depth and half speed. The dive and speed controls in Silent Service 2 are the same as Silent Service 1, except for that a stop is 5 instead of 0, and you can also reverse the sub by hitting 6. So the periscope is controlled with the 9 key rather than the P key, and you go to the periscope with F3, same as Silent Service 1. Here I'm using the comma and period keys to set the bearing of the periscope. In Silent Service 2, they hold your bearing in place, no matter how you've pointed the sub. It doesn't mean you don't want to steer the sub, but you don't generally aim by steering the sub. You can't, actually. So here I've turned to the heading 332, set the bearing at 333, and I'm going to cruise at 5 knots until I get over there with the periscope down. Notice there are only 4 bow tubes and 1 stern tube, because this is a very, very old submarine. As you'll see, it is enough just for shooting at hulks. There's the damage report screen, which is maybe even more period incorrect than the screen in Silent Service 1, but it is, from a practical standpoint, reasonably practical, because it shows you the extent of the damage to the different parts of the sub. F7 will bring up this specifications screen. That SJ radar is the most confusing thing. The original S-classes didn't have any radar at all, but the SJ radar was the standard radar in World War II. What's more confusing is the radar is only operable in certain missions and operates automatically. So in the practice mission, even though it's listed in the specs, you don't get to actually use it. So in a sense, it's realistic, because an S-class would not have radar. That attack table you see down there in the lower right, however, does work. And again, that's not in line with a real S-class, at least not in original configuration. The attack tables or torpedo data computers started coming in with the Porpoise class in 1935. But it's going to take a while for this submarine to get over to the hulks there, because it's only going 5 knots. So even though the hulks are holding still, because they're dead in the water, this submarine, like pretty much all World War II submarines, is very slow. Now, allegedly, at least this version of the S-class in Silent Service 2, I don't know if this is true to life, if you put it in flank speed, it will go 11 knots, which makes it the fastest submarine submerged in Silent Service 2, even though it's the oldest. So I don't know how accurate that is. I'm not using that speed here. I'm just conserving the battery by going half speed. Of course, in real life, the advantage to going slower with a submarine is that you don't create as much propeller noise, so it's harder to detect you. It's generally not a good idea to drive any submarine fast if you are actually in any kind of combat situation at all. I've never been a submariner, but every submariner says this. Every manual of any, submarine game says this, that you don't want to go very fast. In the Cold War, this was actually a bit of a problem because there were 2 submarine classes, the Skipjack class in the U.S. Navy and the Alpha class, or what NATO called the Alpha class in the Soviet Navy. Both of them were very fast, and the submariners really liked this, but the problem was they were noisy. So, you could go very fast with these submarines, but they weren't necessarily such wonderful submarines in real life, because the tendency was to go too fast and to get noticed. Luckily, they never made it into combat, as far as anybody knows. So nobody was actually killed as a result of the skipjacks and the alphas being too noisy. So this is taking a while. As you'll see, once you figure out how these controls work and how these submarines work in the easy skill levels, it's pretty easy to tear right through one of these convoys. Probably that's not realistic. You probably have to try one of the harder skill levels to really get the experience. I'm keeping it simple here because I'm just doing a playthrough, and I don't have a lot of practice on Silent Service 2 yet. I hit the wrong key and it said, "We're dived, sir." I wanted to check the instruments here to check my battery, among other things, because I had never tried the S-Class before this playthrough, so I didn't know how fast the battery was going to run down.